All right, we're going to get started. So thank you all for joining us. This is Understanding Firefighter PPE. And it looks like we got a couple more friends joined in. Greatly appreciate that. So we're going to talk about some things that are near and dear to my heart, which is, what protects you and how does it protect you? So any of you who have taken any of our classes before understand that I'm big on something that I didn't do very well as a young man, which is called reading the instructions. And one of the things I've learned as a firefighter is A, we don't read the instructions. B, we don't think we have time. And when it comes to the training requirements, they really do reduce the amount of reading we're allowed to do based on the time we have. So we're going to talk about certain standards. We're not going to talk about all of them because there's a lot. But one we're going to start with first is Nfpa 1971. How does that affect you? Well, it's the standard for what your PPE is based on for proximity and structural firefighting. Remember what proximity means. Close to, not into. There's two different types of gear there. Be careful, make sure you're reading the right one. Every piece of firefighting clothing you wear is tested to a certain standard. Do you know how it's tested? Do you know how that affects you? And do you know that there is a variance within the standard when it comes to manufacturers? And that variance does affect you. I'm scared to say I found out the hard way. It affects us a little bit more than I realized, just like with thermal imaging cameras. And also, the biggest influencer in how our gear performs is us. Dun, dun, dun. Biggest problem is the end user. How we care for it, how we operate, the overall performance of it, all of that is based on, guess who? My fault. It's not designed for direct flame content or flame contact. It's not designed to walk through fire and be mad because the reflective striping melted off. It has defined limitations. Do you know what those are? We're going to talk about those in depth tonight. Nfpa 1971 has more than 70 tests for PPE. 70. That's a lot of tests to make sure that you and I are able to go in and perform in these IDLH environments. A couple of them I put in here for your reference is one of them is your materials exposed to flame for 12 seconds and must extinguish in 2 seconds. Cannot drip, melt, or reignite. And my favorite one I've read so much about, which is probably the most prevalent test they use, is known as the forced air oven test. Any of you have taken our classes before hear me always talk about using a comparison or analogy to a convection oven. We're crawling in a convection oven. You know why a convection oven cooks faster? Because it circulates heated air. Those of you who taught reading smoke classes or took reading smoke classes have heard the phrase volume, velocity, density, and color. Well, velocity is very important in understanding fire growth and understanding how heat is transferred, especially when you're wearing garments that work by absorbing energy. And if there's lots of velocity, high velocity smoke, high velocity convection currents, what is your gear doing? Absorbing energy. And you will notice a key common number that keeps showing up here, which validates and basically gives my dad a lot of praise in this. This one number keeps showing up. Materials shall not melt or fail at 500 degrees or below. Some of them for 5 minutes, some of them for less than that. There's numerous other tests, but one of my other favorites is called the stored energy test. Those of you who have sat in a flashover container are very familiar with this, because when you're sitting next to your buddy as the instructor's talking about what's occurring around you, he tells you not to touch each other. And if you've ever had a compression or contact burn, like you would see in this picture here on the right, you would understand why. That stored energy test basically means the composite, what you're wearing, must not produce a second-degree burn in less than 130 seconds. So if I press down on you, it shouldn't transfer that energy to you in less than 130 seconds, unless it's saturated. Remember that. There are limitations to these tests. The next one we talk about is the most important one. Why is it most important? Because if you have a car and you don't put oil in it and you don't maintain it, it's not going to run too well, not for very long. So NFPA 1851 is how we select, care, and maintain that PPE. Here's a few chapters for your bedtime reading. Chapter 6, 7, 8, and 10. 6 outlines the inspection of your PPE. How many of you have inspected your gear lately? Taken it apart, looked at it. Or you like me in the mornings when you come in, you're running behind, you just throw your gear on the truck. You make sure you got your stuff in your pockets, you got your gloves, got your hood, check your air pack out, check the tick, all that stuff. But do you look at the gear? We're going to talk about ways you can look at that gear. The difference between a visual inspection and a licensed service provider looking it over. Chapter 7 outlines cleaning of the PPE, not just gross decon or something called preliminary exposure reduction. And Chapter 8 repairs things or talks about repair PPE. That's not something you and I should do. Okay, no matter how good a seamstress you and I think we are, we're not supposed to be fixing it. And Chapter 10 is the most controversial, which I'm glad my friend Mr. Brown's on here, talks about retirement of PPE, which is actually something him and I just discussed recently. And I added a few sections in here because of that, because I grew up in the volunteer fire service and I understand the limitations of budget, and especially when you buy your own stuff. So let's talk about your PPE. It's made of 3 layers. By the way, how many layers of skin do you have? 3. Epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous. You have outer shell, moisture barrier, and thermal liner. That's most gear. And then you may have some little extra components mixed in there, but understand how your gear is put together. And it does not work unless all 3 components are together. There's been cases where firefighters have taken their gear apart and not put in certain parts back. It won't work that way. You've got to have all those parts together. Hang on one second. Let me take care of somebody who's having trouble signing in. So your outer shell is the outer shell. It's like a turtle. It's the tough, durable part. It's the first line of defense. And they're made of various different fabrics, right? So we got to make sure that we're caring for those fabrics. And we'll talk about things we don't want to do to those fabrics that will cause them to fail. They're made from PBI, Nomex Kevlar blends, Kevlar PBI blends, and carbon blends like TechGen and lots of others. Moisture barrier. What is that? It is what it implies. It protects against the intrusion of water, chemicals, and viral agents. That's pretty darn important, because if you think about it, we don't want those things getting to us. But that barrier is breathable. Here's where we fail as the fire service. We're going to talk about that tonight, is this phrase or 3-letter acronym that nobody seems to pay attention to, called THL. We like the TPP acronym because that's how much it can take. But we don't talk about THL. And that affects your ability for your gear to breathe. We want to make sure that that gear has the ability to breathe. So let me mute all these microphones here. All right, and then the last part is the part closest to the body, is called the thermal liner. Well, what is that? It provides protection against thermal insult. We don't want that. So we have to have all 3 components together, taken care of, and we have to understand how they work and how they're rated. So let's get into that. So if you want to know how it works, every piece of gear comes with one of these. Where did I see that? Oh, it was connected to my gear when I ripped it off and threw it in a trash can. That's why I said in the beginning, we don't like reading instructions. Here's the beauty of these instructions. That you can download these manuals for free. If you type in PHMSA official user guide, it'll pop up. Pick hoods, gloves, turnout pants, whatever you want to get. It's a generic warning label for all types of gear. It doesn't get into specifics of your ratings on your gear. It gets in the overview of it. And what you want to understand is that it tells you the defined limitations of your gear and how firefighters have been burned, injured, and killed when they fail to understand that. It talks about how your body works in response to it. It talks about how your gear absorbs energy and how that energy is transferred to us when we fail to recognize that. So those are the things I want you to understand about this. And all this information, ladies and gentlemen, is free. I found it all. I didn't pay for all this information. I basically took pieces of the puzzle and put it together so you can have a broad overview of that tonight. So, and by the way, those of you who have joined in tonight, I have 30 different PowerPoints, plus this video will be shared with all of y'all from the Fiero conference, which goes into depth each of the components of this presentation. So let's talk about life expectancy of your gear. How long is it supposed to last? Well, how long will it last? What affects it? Well, believe it or not, the climate you live in and work in affects that. Okay, you're in a cold place, hot place, humid place, that makes a difference. More importantly, how well you care for it in that and where it's stored. Another one that's near and dear to my heart, which I can pick on Joey because he goes through more fires than I do, the nature and frequency of fires. Are you using your gear more, or is it just hanging in the truck more? And my personal favorite, firefighter physiology. Are you like me, and when you're born with extra sweat glands, then yeah, that may make a difference in how your gear works. We'll talk about that specifically. And this one has been addressed in the last few years, and I hope we're past it. I think we're transitioning from the dirty look is the salty look to the clean look is the salty look. But cleaning your gear is important, not just for how you look, but how it protects you and how it prevents contamination to you. According to NFPA 1851, after 10 years, it is no longer in compliance. Now, that is a recommendation from a consensus standard. Doesn't mean you have to, it just means you are not in compliance with that standard. Just make sure you understand that as a department, that if it's outside of that 10-year window, you can still have it inspected and looked at, and if it's still in good shape, it doesn't mean it's completely useless. And we'll talk about that more here in a minute. So here's the thing about climate. I got this picture off the internet because I am guilty of this more than probably the average person. How many of you like to pull the trucks out on the pad and we sit out and talk to people, and we have the trucks out there where the public can see them, doors are open, and how's the gear? It's hanging on the side of the truck, boots on the ground, because we want to be in a state of readiness, right? Well, what is happening to that outer shell of that gear while it's sitting there in that beautiful summer or fall or spring sun? It is degrading it. Okay, then let's talk about, okay, well, I put it back in my locker or I put it back in the bay. Is it well ventilated? Or did I just shove it back in there after doing live fire training all day and it's moist, wet, nasty? What is that doing as it's sitting in there? Is that dirt and contaminant spreading around and moving into other things? And in that locker, here's my personal favorite, because you can ask my guys that I work with, this is my pet peeve. We don't hook up the Plymo vent or exhaust removal system. And the truck goes on 9 calls that day. And as the truck goes by my locker, each time as they pull in and back out, what are they doing to my gear? Blasting it with diesel smoke. Not a good idea. And this one, most people don't think about. They have these really nice gear racks that are like lockers that are exposed. But even with the doors closed, unless you have UV blocking film on your windows and your bay, UV light is what degrades your gear. So if it's sitting at the right angle, I have seen fire departments and visited them where I walked through the bay and they had these really beautiful locker racks that had gear that looked like it had a partial farmer's tan. And you got to be aware of that. So high moisture content can also contribute to degradation to your PPE when you add it to sunlight, not so much just by itself. So NFPA 1851 gets into recommendations for retirement, okay? So what I want you to think about with this, though, is if you're like one of the departments that's near me that operates on a $20,000 a year budget, can they afford to replace their gear every 10 years? Probably not. So when we do these consensus standards, are we putting ourselves in danger financially and all the other things that we do to them by saying you have to replace it every 10 years? Well, this department may not have that kind of cash. They may not have that funding. What are you doing to them by doing that? What happens when you say, well, you can't respond to fire calls anymore? I think we have to be careful. And it even says in the studies, there needs to be a better way than saying 10 years is the max on these things. There should be a better inspection of them, because I promise you that if you have a 10-year-old car and it's paid for and it's in good shape, you're probably not going to get rid of it. You're probably going to keep it. So the things that we got to do, though, with older gears, it has to be inspected, visibly, checked and washed regularly, and then sent off for a service provider to look at. And make sure that when you dispose of gear, it's very expensive. So where is that gear going? There's ratings and rules on that. You have to cut it up and get rid of it so somebody else can't use it. Or you can talk to my good friend Robert Husey and donate it to a third world country where they don't follow NFPA. Because not for practical application doesn't work in countries that have 10 roofs and their fire station doesn't even have air packs, like my friends in the Philippines. So don't just cut it up and throw it in the dumpster. There are lots of people outside of the United States that live, 1/3 of the world's impoverished, by the way, that would love to have our stuff. Just make sure you follow the right recommendations on how you donate that and the liabilities behind it. So it says this in this technical note 1746, which I thought was profound. It is important to develop improved guidelines for the retirement of firefighters' turnout gear that are based on performance metrics. So Mr. Brown, I hope you heard that. And that's why I put that in there, because I did a little reading on it. Because if you paid $700 for this helmet, I don't think you want to get rid of it in 10 years, especially if it's in good shape, just because NFPA says it's not any good. So think about that when you're adopting certain standards. All right, let's get into dirty gear versus clean gear. Dirty gear and clean gear, obviously clean gear is going to function better. Why? What absorbs heat faster? Dirt, obviously. So when we have dirt, soot, moisture, things of that nature on our gear, and we go to fight a fire, and you're in clean gear and I'm in dirty gear, your gear is going to perform better because my gear is dirty and it's going to absorb heat faster, and I'm going to be hollering and saying it's hot in here, and you're going to say, what's wrong with you? The other thing we don't think about when we have dirty gears, every time we get it dirty, we don't clean it, we don't think about where it's going. It's something called layer by layer contamination. Our gear is not bulletproof. That stuff soaks through, gets through cracks and crevices, and I'll show you how. And the other problem we have, and I am super guilty of this, gloves, hoods, boots, and helmets aren't always cleaned properly. And being a bald man, I understand cleaning the helmet a lot better now than I used to, especially I have friends who've had cancer cut off of their head, and they had full heads of hair when they got it. So how you clean it? What are the rules, regulations, and what are the basics? Without having to read this 200 pages worth of stuff, how about something called gross decon? Well, they took that out and changed it to preliminary exposure reduction. It's just a fancy word for every time you have an exposure, your gear gets dirty, food on the stove, a real fire, got it nasty and dirt, whatever, it's gross decon. You brush stuff off, rinse it off, an approved detergent, and you change out your dirty hood for a clean hood. You use wipes on your contact areas, such as fire wipes, and you don't allow your gear to hang out in the sun, which is what I used to do. I'm throwing myself under the bus. I'm not preaching at you. I did all this stuff, okay? Trying to protect you and say, these are the mistakes I've made, okay? Here's another one I made as a volunteer firefighter. How many of us as volunteers carry our gear in our truck where our family is, where they breathe that stuff that's off-gassing? Do you know why they don't want us taking this stuff into the bedrooms and whatnot? Because it will basically off-gas the stuff that you've been exposed to long after the fire. You want your kids breathing that? No. Another thing is CBRN incident exposure, basically chemical, biological, radiation, or nuclear. You think that if we're exposed to a chemical incident, our gear is going to be cleaned and given back to us? No, more than likely it's going to be condemned, retired, or disposed of. And hopefully we're not disposed of. Hazmat exposure, however, depending on what it is, can be cleaned, inspected, and cleaned by a service provider. And I'm going to talk to my hazmat friends here a little bit later about boots and dispel some myths about rubber boots. Dirty gear, the basics. Your fire department should have an established guideline on cleaning the gear. Approved gear washing machines, and read some of the PowerPoints I'll share with you that came from the Fiero conference on how they're changing those standards, what temperatures it should be washed at, what soap you should use, and how it's properly dried, such as air drying your gloves instead of wringing them out and messing up the liners inside of them. Here's another thing that I didn't know. If you wash your gear initially, the first 5 washes, it does something called lofting. You know what that means? It improves the thermal protective performance of your gear initially. That's pretty cool. Didn't know that. Eventually, the case may be that your TPP and THL will degrade over time. But if you take good care of your gear, it will take good care of you. But we want to use gear washers, not regular washing machines. We don't want to use just basic Tide. We want to use what the department or what the provider or manufacturer tells us to do. We don't hang it out in the sunlight to dry. I know I've done it too, but you're taking away precious seconds that you could use in a fire to save somebody's loved one by doing that. Okay. And remember, dirty gear absorbs heat. Do you want to absorb more heat, or you want to absorb heat based on your ability of the gear's thermal protective performance? You don't want to lessen that by having dirty gear. It's like going to the gym to work out already tired. You're not going to perform very well. So here's the thing. You've probably seen these stickers and signs all over fire departments across America. This is from the Firefighter Cancer Support Network. It says, after the fire, the exposure continues. Why? So you should treat the bay like a hot zone. If we carry the PPE into the bedroom or into the kitchen, I used to wear my turnout pants and sit down at the kitchen table, you're exposing people and other areas to that, and you're tracking all that stuff everywhere. And then the other thing, like I said about taking it home with you, the danger of off-gassing becomes heightened because when we transport in our gear in our personal vehicles or put it by our bedside like I used to do, we're not only asking for it, we're getting it. We're sleeping and breathing it in. You know, inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. Most of it's inhalation and absorption for us now. And the inhalation is not so much in the fires after the fact when we're doing stuff like this or an overhaul. And this is my pet peeve. This is what a wall looks like when you don't plug up the $30,000 Plymouth vent system your department bought for you because we're too lazy to hook up the hose. If it makes a white brick wall look like that, what do you think it's doing to your lungs? That's unnecessary exposure when you're not even in a fire. Diesel smoke's been linked to 4 different types of cancer. And yet, when you drive out the bay with the Plymouth vent not hooked up because it looks cool, with black smoke pushing out of that diesel engine, and you charge 7 lockers full of diesel smoke, you just less than 7 different firefighters' ability to fight fire because of our laziness and complacency. And I've done it. That's why it's a pet peeve of mine, because they always say you get angry at people because of the very things that you can't stand about yourself. Well, I'm there. I'm trying to fix my own mistakes. So here it is. This was taken the other day at my station. Hook up the hose. How hard is it to do that? I walk by and hook that hose up every time I see it. Each time that truck is cranked and that's not hooked up, we're asking for it. You're also pumping carbon monoxide into the bay. Why buy a system and not use it? I mean, seriously, why would we do all this and not use it? And then we see all of these cancer lawsuits, presumptive cancer legislation, and we're too lazy to hook the hose up? We're asking for it long before we go to the fire. If you take a class by the Fire Smoke Coalition, they'll tell you not to put the ice machine in the bay. Why? Because where's it drawing air from? The bay, which is full of soot, smoke, carbon monoxide from us not hooking up the bay. They said, how's those carcinogenic ice cubes taste? Not so good. So what does our PPE really protect us from? It does protect us from certain levels of thermal insult. Not all of them. Not direct flame contact and not for very long. Certain chemicals, certain biohazard exposures, but it does not protect us from us, ourselves. There are defined limitations of the gear, when we should retire it, when we should clean it, and we should know how to do all that. We shouldn't be ignorant if we're supposed to be professionals who are going in to save people's lives and property, because this stuff allows us to do it better. So when I say fully protected, there's a great study by the Fire Service Cancer Toolkit, or not by them, but they have the pictures in there from the IAFF, where they dressed all the firefighters up fully encapsulated, and they sprayed them with a silica dust. It's a fluorescent silica dust. And they just sprayed them all around to show that even when you were buttoned up, zipped up, hood on, mask on, breathing air, that we are still being exposed. Didn't think that happened, did we? Why do you think these wipes are so important now? Look at his neck. Look at his ear. Right there where the hood was. Wait a minute. I thought I was protected to a certain extent. And look at this. When I talked about layer by layer contamination, these are photos of fire gear after the fire. You look at the interior side of the garment outer shell, and then you look at the moisture barrier side. When we're getting closer to our skin, what do you see? You see carbonaceous soot permeating through all 3 layers to our skin. This is from Jeff Ostol from International Personal Protection Company. He did a great presentation on broadening cleaning practices. I'll share the PowerPoint with you. Point being is, if all that gets through our gear and then we sweat, and they've proven when we sweat, our pores open up and do what? Take our absorption rate up as much as 400%. Skin's the largest organ in your body. We're not breathing it as much as we are absorbing it. And we wonder why we're getting cancer. This is why you inspect your gear. This is why you clean your gear. This is why you look at things a little bit more closely than we used to. What about gloves? These are my good friend Ryan Pennington's company, Vanguard MK1. I'm a Fire Dex or Vanguard guy myself, but they're good glove. Point being, it doesn't matter what glove it is if I don't clean them. And here's something I'm going to ask you a particular interesting question about. We wear our gloves in the fire, right? We wear our gloves in overhaul. And then we wonder why when we wash them, if we don't clean them properly, even when we take our gloves off, have you noticed that your hands were black? A recent study showed by the UL that it had 1,000 times higher percentages of heavy metals in our gloves. In our gloves. And our hands are just soaking it up. Would you knowingly stick your hand in a 5-gallon bucket full of carcinogens every single day? No, but we're doing that. And here's why. This is common sense, we think, right? Wash your hands. Okay, when you get done fighting a fire, do you leave your gloves on when you're loading hose? I've seen firefighters, including myself, grabbing dirty hose, dirty tools. And I was even fussed at by one of my mentors at a training incident several years ago. There was a hose on the ground. It wasn't properly flaked out. What did I do? I reached down and grabbed it, pulled the kinks out of it like I'm supposed to, but I did it with my bare hand. He come up, smacked me on the back and said, people are watching you and they're going to emulate your behavior. Put your gloves on. And if you're going to touch gloves and they're not in the actual IDLH, or you're going to touch dirty stuff and you're not in the IDLH environment, you can just wear your EMS gloves when you're cleaning up. Because if you don't, your hands are going to look like this. Here's another question for you. How many of you got families? You come home and several days later, when you're sitting on the couch, you notice that you smell like smoke. Why is that? Because now your skin that has absorbed all that is now starting to release some of that stuff, and you're smelling it because your skin's the largest organ in your body. And if your gloves allows it to permeate through and it's got all those heavy metals in it and that's going straight into you, it's not good. So all I'm asking, I'm challenging you on certain behaviors. Wear your gloves when you're fighting fire. When you're done fighting fire and you're cleaning up, wear another type of glove and clean your hands. Clean them good. Use fire wipes, use soap and water, and make sure that we're doing that in between incidents as well. If Corona's taught us anything, we got the cleanest hands any nation's had this year. How about hoods? Traditional membrane particulate blocking, non-woven filtration particulate blocking hoods. There are more choices in hoods right now than there's ever been. But do you understand them and how they work? We all had a traditional hood, whether it's Nomex, Kevlar blend, PBI. Those are great hoods. There's nothing wrong with that. The membrane ones almost act like your standard gear where it has 3 layers. Not a big fan of the membrane ones because this guy gets extremely hot. And it doesn't allow, for me anyways, with my bald head, allow that heat off. It actually nauseates me. Where the non-woven filtration particulate blocking hoods, more like a quilted material, those have actually fitted me better and I felt better in those. But bottom line is, how well do they protect us? Do you know there are still today in the United States of America and in other countries, firefighters refusing to wear hoods because they want to feel the heat with their ears? So let me ask you a question. I ask this in all my classes. Would you let your kid walk across the kitchen and touch a hot stove to know how hot it is? No. We spend 26 weeks telling our recruits, keep your gear on, keep your gloves on. And then we hear firefighters not wearing their hood, taking their glove off, sticking their hand up in the smoke. You get an injury from that in our world today, that is a workers' comp nightmare, and they're going to get denied. And in addition to that, you're going to find out really quickly that a hand burn is a critical burn, could be a career-ending burn injury. And on top of that, if you want to use your body as a thermometer, realize this, that your body quits using the ability to measure temperature at 140 degrees Fahrenheit because your pain receptors go numb. So if you're going to use your ears, you're going to fight fire at 140 and below, because after that, you're not going to feel it. That's not my data. That's NIST, that's physics, that's Alice Stoll, and a lot of other things we're going to talk about. Now, on the flip side of that, there are people who don't wear a hood. They wear 2 to 3 hoods when they're doing live burn instruction. Now, let me ask you a question. You're not going to wear a hood in a fire, but when you're doing live fire scenarios, you're going to wear 2 to 3 hoods. Why? Because I want to be able to stand up and stay in there longer. That's like saying I'm going to wrap the baked potato twice, but you're going to be the baked potato to keep the heat in. You understand that your gear works by absorbing heat, and the higher the TPP is, the more it absorbs it. So look at the difference in the hoods here. Here's your traditional hood versus a particulate blocking hood. Doesn't matter which one you pick, they all have pros and cons. But look at that silica dust, that fluorescent silica dust in a traditional hood versus the one when we have the particulate blocking hood. You pick your poison, you go and test them. Don't take my word, but look at the difference in these hoods and how it's blocking stuff. But make sure you test them. Don't just say, well, this one works really good at blocking stuff. Well, I wore one that worked really good at blocking stuff. Also, my ability to sweat and made me sick. So make sure you wear them, test them before you decide to buy them. Here's a good one. Learned a lot on this one. Boots. How clean are your boots? Where do your boots go? How many places do you step? How many of you, here's another one. How many of you have wore your duty boots, not your fire boots, your duty boots home, like I used to do? How many places did you step with those boots that you wouldn't want your family to touch? How many times did you go in somebody else's house, somebody else's business, get in a fire truck, go into the kitchen, put your feet up on the coffee table? You really see where I'm going with this? That's just your duty boots. Now let's talk about fire boots. Where do they go? What environment are they in? And that's just the outside of it. So when we fail to clean them and we clean our gear and then we put our clean gear back on dirty boots, we get cross contamination and we keep spreading that stuff on us. And here's the other thing I didn't know. You would think rubber boots would clean easier and decon easier. That's not scientifically accurate. After a lot of really interesting reading, I learned that rubber absorbs more chemicals than leather, and actually about 86% more. And it's still, even with that, we're still not cleaning them. The downside is when we do clean them, it takes a long time to dry them. So those forced air dryers are great if you have those, or the PVC systems. Very good systems. Make sure you have something set up, because not a lot of departments are blessed like ours. We have 2 sets of gear. So we may not have 2 sets of boots, but if you got 2 sets of gear, at least you can dry your stuff out in between fires. And here's that study. This is from Gore and Associates, you know, the ones that make Gore-Tex stuff. Leather versus rubber boots after decontamination. They cleaned the gear where you looked at it. Both of them, rubber boot and leather boot, look clean. Visual inspection showed no contamination. Then they put it in this fancy oven called a thermal desorption test at 160 degrees Celsius, or around 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Leather had 86.8 microns, or microns per 1-inch disc, whereas rubber had 900 per 1-inch disc. And here's the other interesting thing for my hazmat gurus. If they were exposed to a petroleum product, the rubber absorbed more of it than the leather. Who would have thought? And our hazmat guys wear rubber boots in their gear. They don't wear leather boots last time I checked. So another interesting study for those of you who like interesting things about boots. I love the boots I wear now. I wear these from Fire Decks. Now, they're very comfortable. What I didn't know is they've done studies on boots and fatigue, that leather boots and the leather composite actually fit us better than rubber boots. Rubber boots will slide. Rubber boots are actually heavier. And in this study, it talks about firefighters walk slower, took wider steps with rubber boots. And when this study was done on stairs, by the way, and that it took them longer because they were trying to balance their body while they were walking. This is from NIOSH. This is not some third party, somebody who's getting paid a bunch of money to back a particular manufacturer. And then the other studies, they found the boot weight was found to affect the way they walked and moved their lower bodies. Now, I'm already clumsy. Now you're going to give me something that makes me clumsier. It limited my ability to move my ankle, my knee, my hip motions. How many of you are like me and already hurt anyway? And now you're going to make me wear something that makes me hurt more. It's harder to maintain balance or crossing obstacles and crawling and moving. Didn't know it, but rubber boots actually make you more tired or fatigued than a custom fit leather boot or composite. So how about the good old helmets? We love our helmets, right? We like our leathers. We like our fake ones that look like the Carnes 1010 here. I know everybody gets upset when you look at Euro helmets and whatnot, but bottom line, we need a helmet. And your helmet's designed to protect you from impact, up to 850 foot-pounds of resistance hitting you in the head, top down. Well, it takes 1,000 pounds of downward force can break a human neck. So basically what it's saying is if it's greater than 850, you're in trouble. Now, why would I be in trouble even if I had a good helmet on? Because I didn't like the ratchet strap and I didn't like the components in there, so I took it out because it looks cool. That's not good. So I disabled the shock absorption of that helmet. Then fiberglass helmets have higher melting temperatures than leather. In other words, they last longer in the fire environment, but they don't look as cool, right? And they're not as heavy. When you get older, you don't want to wear that leather helmet because you end up with what they call football neck. All right. Helmets, unfortunately, are not properly decontaminated. We clean the outside, just like in the Bible, he says, you clean the outside of the dish, but not the inside. We're whitewashed tombs. That's not good because where are you being exposed? The inside of the helmet, the liner. That's where a lot of the cross contamination is occurring. That liner, that assembly, that kind of thing. Whoops, went too fast. Let me go back. So when we look at traditional helmets that are in use today, you've got your leather, you got your Metro, you got your European, which everybody likes to get in a fight about. I don't care which preference you have, as long as you're wearing one and wearing one properly. And then you got your wildland style, your out west. Point being is when you're done using them in an incident, we need to clean them. Soap and water, not a solvent, and clean the inside of them. You can use your fire wipes or whatever, do your preliminary exposure reduction, fancy word for gross decon, and then go back and clean them. There are departments overseas that have these fancy machines that look like basically they're $20,000 dishwashers, and they put their air packs in them, they put their helmets in them, they're using ultrasonic cleaning stuff. It's big business. Okay, cleaning our stuff's big business. If you don't believe me, go look at a washer and dryer in your home improvement store, and then look at a gear extractor / washer dryer for fire gear and look at the difference in the cost in that thing. You're looking at $1,000 for a washer and dryer for your home versus $30,000 for an extractor system for your fire station. You really think it costs that much? I don't think so. And here's something that we mess up on a lot. If you look at the very inside of the helmet here, specifically when we start talking about the ratchet headband system, number 11 there, the crown pad, the foam adjustment, we take all that out, make it fit better, right? Looks cooler. I don't want all that stuff hanging around me. But what is that foam adjustment kit? What is that crown pad? What is all that stuff for? It's supposed to absorb impact. So when I take that out and I get hit in the head with a beam from 30 feet up, does that change the ability of that gear to perform? Absolutely. Somebody asked, wonder how a leather helmet would fare versus a composite on Decon. I haven't read the studies on that yet, but it'd be interesting to see what they say about that. I will look that up for you because I don't have an exact answer. I'm guessing what it would be, but I don't want to base your risk your life on my guess or opinion. So we'll look that one up and get you better information on that. So the fancy word preliminary exposure reduction / gross decon. Our department has went full bore on that, and we have the red buckets with the soap and the brush, and we're supposed to use the booster line and rinse ourselves off at every fire and use the fire wipes. Now, does it always happen? No. Should it? Yes. If we're dirty, we should do it. Now, here's something I want you to think about that you probably know that when you got insulation and junk all over you, you're going to clean that off. I get that. But how many food on the stove calls could you run in a day with that nice, what appears to be clean hood around your neck? When it's exposed to smoke, it's a sponge. So then you go on 9 fire alarms after that, and you put the hood on, you take it off, and you put it on, you take it off, you put it on, take it off. You see what you're doing? You're putting on something that's soaked with unknown contaminants and smoke and putting it around your neck where your thyroid gland is. How many firefighters you know have thyroid cancer, right? So it's beyond just cleaning the nasty stuff. It's the basic stuff we fail at. So wash off the contaminants, soap, water, and brush. Also, be careful what soap you use. I don't know if y'all read much on this, but it really opened my eyes in the last few years. How many carcinogens are in the basic things in our home? Lauryl sulfate's almost in every soap. It's one of the carcinogens. It's in Dawn. It's in Tide. It's in lots of stuff. Well, you think, well, it's less than 1%. Well, you got less than 1% in your shower soap, less than 1% in your soap at your kitchen sink, less than 1% in your body lotion, less than 1% over here, and then you less 1% in your charred barbecue. You see where I'm going with this? You just keep adding up. My friend of mine said this very wisely. We're all making cancer deposits, praying we don't make a cancer withdrawal. We don't need any more stuff shoved into our bodies. So when you go to a fire or an incident where you get exposed, do your gross decon, use your wipes, and if you're blessed enough to have a second set of gear, bag your gear, return to the station, clean up your stuff while you're dirty with gloves on, and get a shower. Now, there's studies on saunas and working out and sweating it out. I'm not going to get into that argument, but I mean, I'd love for every time we have a fire that we get a salon treatment, where we get to that kind of thing, where we get the spa, we get the sauna, we get to work out. You imagine how many hours out of service we get after every fire if they allowed us to do that? Every fire, by the time we got back, did all that, I mean, that'd be like 2-3 hours later. We'd all be ready for a nap. Like we're not going to take one anyway. But point being is, do your basics, clean up, right? So what other things can mess our gear up? Now, I told you I was guilty of exposure to UV radiation. I've done it at training, thrown my gear down, left it laying there in the sun. In some cases, you didn't have much choice. You're out there working. Just recently did some really awesome hose training, loved it, but I left my stuff laying around. I could have laid it in the shade. I could have put it inside a battalion car. Nah, I was lazy, laid it there on the ground because I had to go talk, right? Go hang out. That's degrading my gear. The level of usage, how much you're putting it on, taking it off, going to fires, wrecks, and all the things we wear it for, fire alarms, how often we clean it, and my most favorite topic is thermal exposure, and we're going to get into that at the end. Here's an interesting little chart for you about the sun and the power of the sun, okay? The sun breaks down your gear faster than older gear. Those of you who have been around longer than 20 years, I will tell you this. If we could go back to what we used to wear, we would solve a lot of our problems today, because if you had cotton jackets and hip boots, number one, they'd open the nozzle when it got hot. And number two, they wouldn't expose themselves to certain things because they'd feel it and say, Well, when we put on this new composite gear, it has basically chemical structures, and it's an inherent UV absorber. In other words, it likes sunlight. It will absorb it and break down the gear, changes the surface, makes the gear brittle, which makes it break apart, generates free radicals, lightens the gear, which you'll notice if somebody's left their gear out in the sunlight a lot, it weighs less. And it also reduces its mechanical properties, the ability to take abrasion, and you can actually see through it in some cases. And here's an interesting factoid for you. From the studies I read on this particular study on the accelerated weathering of Firefighter PPE, 14 24-hour days of UV exposure equated to 6.6 years of leaving your gear out in the sun. Isn't that interesting? And it would degrade the tear strength of your gear by as much as 87%. Now, outer shells vary depending on which one you have. I'm not going to get into beating up manufacturers and who's got the best one. Point being is they all will fade and deteriorate if they're exposed to UV light. UV light is bad news for PPE because it does something called a fancy word called chain scission. I'm getting pronounced it scission. Scissors, basically. You got a thread that's put together. It's got a chemical bond or polymer, and it breaks that down. It breaks down those organic polymers and leads to embrittlement, makes it brittle and breaks apart. So the individual threads fail, and then the weave or the ripstop fails. Your polymers absorb light, and it messes everything up. So we paid big money for this gear, and then we don't take care of it. We're taught, I mean, I remember 22 years ago, don't leave your gear out in the sun. They told me that then. Hadn't changed. And here me laying my gear, my favorite set of gear out in the sun here when we were in Bedford, Virginia. Because it was wet. I needed to dry off a little bit. It was cold that morning, right? There's better ways of doing this. That's why I'm preaching at myself, not at you, okay? But these high performance fibers are inherent absorbers of ultraviolet light, and it breaks it down because it absorbs that light, and those photoreactions cause those chain bonds to break apart. Now, how can we fix that? You can put UV blocking film on your windows in your bay and on your fire truck. It doesn't have to be window tinting, but they do have film that blocks UV light that's still clear. That's an interesting fact that I didn't know. So you can do that if you have all those racks where all your stuff's out in the bay and prevent your gear from being damaged. Remember, UV light or damage is kryptonite to that very expensive gear that you had to write grants for, or your department worked hard for, had fundraisers for, or in my case, waited years for someone to sponsor us, and we're blessed to have it. I want to take care of it, right? So we've been going for at 50 minutes. We're going to take a quick bathroom break. And if you have any questions, I'm going to check the chat room real quick. Yep. So let's see. Everybody's saying the same things here. If you have any particular questions, let's see. Sweatband, liner, and ear flaps on the helmet. Yep, need to clean those. And there's asking about leather helmets versus fiberglass. Obviously, condition of the helmet makes a difference. And EJ asked about 14 hours per day. That was 14 24-hour days. Equates to 6.6 years of actual damage. And have I seen anything on the TFT Decon packs? Yes, I've seen those. I've seen some other systems. I've seen another one called Citrus Squeeze. There's a lot of different ones out there. I'm not as well versed in those as much as I should be. I like the soaps that don't have any kind of carcinogens in them. Soap and water together is much better than a chemical-based type agent. My opinion, unless you're dealing with something that you know has been tested, and how long has it been tested? What are the effects of your gear, number one? Does it have anything in it that's going to harm you? How much rinsing does it take to get that out? Because if you read the studies on the actual gear washing, there's a specific cycle it has to go through. It has to get to a certain temperature. How does that interact with that soap? The Citrus Squeeze stuff I've read a lot about. I like it because it's an orange oil based soap and it breaks it down. You actually soak it in a bucket and you can see the stuff breaking off of it and you rinse it off. Like I say, I know Dawn dish liquid is not exactly the best thing. Dahlgren A Decon solution. I'm not familiar with that, but I will be after tonight. I'll try to put out a little bulletin on different types of soaps and cleaners for you as well. I think the conference resource folder that I'll share with you from Fiero has a lot of that stuff in there, but it's a ton of information. So, any other questions? All right, we're going. Let's see, what time is it? It is 7:47. Take 10 minutes. I'll see you in 7:57. All right, thanks. Let's see, just got back. Color of bunker gear and how that may affect performance. I've seen some studies advocating for black turnouts with bright reflectors that perform decently across most hours of the day. Any thoughts? We're currently in gold. Similar studies about gold color blending in with bricks. Tested black, as you said, loved it, went with gold. Switched to black outer shell based on visual acuity and contrast at night. Yeah. The thing is about gear and colors, there's lots of different things about safety and colorizations of things. Black will absorb heat more just out in the sun, but that's obviously not where we're supposed to be. But when you're on accidents and whatnot, you may feel some difference with that. The thing about the sublimation and the dye, that comes from UV damage. That doesn't come from the actual color. You can do that with any gear. So the other thing is the color of the gear is not so much the issue as the dye they use and how we treat it. So it's not a big deal per se of which color you use. It's more of a bigger deal on how we treat it and what we do. We got to make sure that we're taking care of our gear. We got to make sure that we're basically learning to use common sense when it comes to that. I like my black gear that I have. I've had tan gear pretty much my whole career until got my own black gear. Now, have I noticed that the black fades? Yes, it does, but we wash it a lot. So any bright color or dark color is going to fade if you use it a lot. So any other questions about that? And this picture you see here is from Loveland, Colorado, doing some fog nail piercing nozzle work, putting out a fully involved attic fire with a 20 GPM nozzle. Ooh, heresy, right? Cool drone shot though. Any other questions while we're waiting? My wife was kind enough to give me a little quick snack dinner here. You aware of any studies to support barrier hoods versus clean the neck and shower within an hour? Yes, the particulate blocking hoods show that they're stopping the actual exposure beforehand. So yeah, a particular blocking hood does work better than a standard meta aramid hood or double knit hood. The problem with either one is getting back and cleaning up within that hour that you say. Am I A, wiping it off? B, here's my personal favorite that I've done more than anything. I do all that. I do my gross decon, and then I grab my dirty helmet and I shove it back on my hot, sweaty, bald head and go inside and do overhaul because I can't let my guys stand there and do all the work. I got to get in there with them, right? Well, what's that nasty liner doing to my bald head? Then we run 2 more calls before we get back. It's been beyond an hour. I'm absorbing all that stuff. So the less exposure, the better. I would highly recommend you test different hoods. Don't just buy one based on what the salesman says. And I mean, when I mean test them, I mean like wear them in a fire, live fire, or go do a firefighter functional fitness-based workout with it on and see how you feel. I wore one that had a membrane-based layer in between, and it crinkled, and I couldn't hear anything. It nauseated me. There's different ones out there that are better than others. Let's see. We thought about using sublimation as a good visual indicator for shell damage. Not so much. Yeah, don't want to see dirt. I understand that, but both of them can hide dirt. Sublimation can happen from UV damage, can occur from high exposure to heat, can occur from a lot of things. Can occur from a chemical spill or anything like that on them. So it's not just the sunlight hitting it. We're going to spend next hour talking about, or hour and a half really, about my favorite thing, about thermal protection. Yeah, hoods can make a difference if you mask up with your gloves on. Yes, that is true. That takes practice though. They got to do it. What was dinner? Dinner is one of those freezer meals that you throw in the pan. It's chicken, pasta, carrots, corn. It's like a conglomeration, cornucopia of stuff. That's my wife buys these quick and easy ones for when we're in a hurry, and she's doing the homeschool stuff for my daughter. She's got the hard job, so keeping Emma focused on studies and all the things going on in the house. So if you don't learn to appreciate your spouse, ladies and gentlemen, better, because they're holding the line at home every single day, holding a 2.5 by themselves. Plus, I had a leftover pork chop earlier out of the refrigerator. Keep me from eating something bad. I have this problem, like food. All right, 7:56, got 1 minute left. All right, we're gonna start back up here. So we've talked about a lot of things about your gear in general, but now we're gonna talk about the environment you work in. Even though we supposedly don't fight fires as much anymore, fires are more dangerous than they've ever been, and fires have gone up, believe it or not. It's just the fact that we also run other calls. So when you add more numbers to it, it doesn't look like you run as many, but we do. Now, certain departments, like my buddy Joey, run more fire than we do. But in general, when you're wearing firefighting gear, I challenge you to read the instructions, number one. Also challenge you to look at the label on it, which says firefighting is inherently dangerous and hazardous to your health. You can be injured or killed in doing this job. This gear does not make you bulletproof, basically, in layman's terms. The key to firefighting gear is it works by absorbing and releasing energy. Okay. How does it do that? You have something known as TPP, which is thermal protective performance, how it absorbs energy until a certain point, and then it's maxed out, and that energy goes where? To you. Well, it works in cooperation with something called THL, total heat loss. Total heat loss is how the rating of how fast the gear releases that energy, both heat and vapor, and it's its breathability. The Nfpa minimum is 205. The problem is that's an inverse relationship between those two numbers typically until recently. And THL has gotten a bad rap because firefighters didn't want to feel anything. They thought if they felt heat, the gear wasn't any good. The problem is the number one cause of firefighter death still to this day, besides suicide, is overexertion, stress, and medical incidents. Well, what's causing that? How many of you know how your body works as far as when you sweat? How does it cool? It cools by sweating and then evaporating. There's a city of Shelby going to do work. They use my street as a cut through. So when I sweat and my sweat does not evaporate, what happens to my core temperature? It goes up. What happens to the stress on my heart? It increases. It's been known to cause all kind of terrible things to our heart. So if I don't have a good high THL or a balance between THL and TPP, I'm in trouble. And you know what I've learned in the last 2 years of wearing gear that has a higher THL? I don't stand up in the fire with the higher THL, but I shouldn't have been anyway. But I went and did 17 evolutions in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, and did 18 burns in one day in West Virginia Public Safety Expo, and then took my wife out for dinner and felt fine. Then I did 3 burns with my good friend who's on the call here at my department wearing Globe GX Extreme, and I went home and took a nap because I felt awful because that gear holds the heat in and has a low THL. So if I hold the heat in and I don't take my gear off in between burns, which very few people do, what am I doing? I'm cooking myself because it has a lower THL. It takes longer for that heat to come off of me. It takes longer for that vapor to come through. By the way, it takes a minimum of 20 to 25 points in difference for you to feel the difference in THL. We can talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So here's something I didn't know. Did you know that if they publish a particular number for your TPP and THL, that they're allowed a variance? The manufacturer is up to 8 to 10%. So it can be, if they tell you, for example, your TPP is 40, which means you roughly have 20 seconds of protection and flashover temperatures before you receive a second-degree burn, They can be 8% off, plus or minus. Could be good, could be worse. They have a 10% variance in THL. And you think, well, it's not that bad. Well, look at my buddy Thomas's shoulder here. Does that variance matter to you now? Especially when you got to think about our gear is not brand new out of the bag every morning when we come to work. It could be dirty, could have been absorbed with carbon monoxide and diesel smoke from the other shift not hooking up the plumb vent, could be wet. So that's important to know that it's not as high as a protection as we think. If you want to play with those numbers, I included a link there. You can go to Firedex's website and you can actually build your own spec, and you can watch as you play with the TPP and the THL and the numbers, how they go up and down. And you don't have to buy a set of gear from it. It just gives you a spec on there. So it's something for you to play with so you can see how that works. Now, I asked you in the beginning, have you read the instructions on your turnout gear? This is a snippet from that PHMSA manual. It says in here, if your ensemble, that's a fancy word for the clothes we wear, is exposed to radiant, convective, or conductive heat, you may be burned underneath that ensemble with no warning, with no sign of damage to that gear. Be constantly alert to the possibility of exposure to radiant, convective, or conductive heat and other hazards. How on God's green earth are you supposed to be constantly alert to radiant, convective, or conductive heat if you can't see it and you can't feel it? Just a question. You can come take one of our thermal imaging classes and see more about that. The eyes and the ears are not good enough. You need a diagnostic tool to be able to see, and your gear is so good, as Al Huxley said, it's giving you better ways to deteriorated ends, okay? So here's some data for you, some food for thought. Our skin, human skin, is destroyed at 162 degrees. You think, well, I'm wearing gear. That's not going to affect me. Yes, it will. We'll get into the specifics of that here shortly. Your face piece, in all the face piece studies, the average temperature at which it failed was 356 degrees, which is what you bake cookies at. And the best Nomex hoods on the market, with the exception of the Captain Jim hood and the Clifford Reed hood, all start to break apart at 572 degrees. Remember that 500 number I said in the beginning? And then we start getting into fire behavior. The ignition temperature of carbon monoxide is 1128 degrees. And the average temperature of flashover is about 4 times the limitation of your gear. U.S. Naval Report, Stoll Curve, NIST Face Piece Study, NIST website, and about 6 other research papers all say the same thing. Why? If you're hurting in PPE, the victim's dying in pajamas. Think about this. Your gear is some of the best ever designed, but the victim doesn't have that protection. So when we're crawling around saying it's not that hot, they would beg to differ with us. Okay, this is an example of stored energy. This is my friend Thomas's shoulder at Firehouse Expo. How long will it be until he feels pain or is burned? What if he bumps into something? What if we push on him? See, these are things that are happening to your gear that you can't see. This is the thermal environment. This was one of the last part of how gear is going to last and hold up, is basically how much heat is it exposed to on a regular basis. Well, that's just one part. That's just your coat. It's not your air pack. It's not your helmet. It's not your gloves, not your boots. All of them have different thermal protective performance ratings. All of them are not as strong. Did you know that? That your coat and your pants are stronger than probably anything else you wear? So if we have all this stuff on, do you realize that we're no different than the victim when we start to feel pain? Because your skin starts to actually break down at 110 degrees. And when you feel pain, bee sting-like sensations when you're driven to the floor wearing gear, that is something that's inside that PHMSA manual known as alarm time. That is something that Alice Stoll figured out, and that's why you have the 3-letter acronym Thermal Protective Performance, which means your gear has absorbed all the energy it can absorb, and physics says heat travels hot to cold, and your gear is saturated with heat, and now you're the coldest thing in the room despite how many firefighter calendars you've been in, and that heat energy is now being transferred to your flesh. At around 131 degrees and some change, it produces a second-degree burn. Now, if we don't move away from that pain, and that doesn't work by putting water on the outside of your gear, you have to come out of it. At 140 degrees, your pain receptors turn off. It's a protection mechanism that the good Lord put in your body. And if that temperature continues to increase, our skin is destroyed at 162. So we're no different than the victim, except for the fact that we can push it further and not know until it's too late. And then the weakest link we have, at least we think, is our face piece. And if it fails and we're exposed to the same superheated gases that the victim is, after 20 seconds of 185 degrees of superheated air in your trachea, we're dead. So there's not much difference between us and the victim if we don't understand the environment and the gear that we wear. Well, let's talk about the environment, the gear we wear, and how it's tested. Your gear, whether it's an air pack, a pass device, a tick, a radio, anything that has electronics in it is tested in one of 4 thermal classifications. These 4 thermal classes are tested in basically the equivalent of a convection oven. Okay, so here's something I want you to really think hard about. There are documented exposures and failures in the 212 to 250 degree temperature range. That's not that hot, but it's long exposures, upwards of 20 minutes. How many times have you been in a fire for a long time? You know, you're in there fighting a warehouse fire. You're doing in and out, changing bottles, relieving them at an apartment fire. Long duration exposures. And you know what failed first? Let's see, ticks, electronic equipment, and face pieces. Okay, especially radios too. So let's bump that temperature up a little bit more. Now we're at 320 degrees Fahrenheit at 15 minutes, and we're starting to get some convection currents moving. It's what they call heat flux. It's heat transfer. Our radio will start to fail. So one of you mentioned in the chat room the Fairfax radio study. If you notice in that study, it talks about the value of keeping that radio underneath your coat for numerous reasons, one of which is thermal protection, because people who wrapped it around their neck, like I used to do, it would melt the cord off, and then I would key up the mic and say, Mayday, 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 and nobody would hear it because the cord is gone, right? So if we step up just a little bit more, we've moved from the front room to the living room. We're 1 room away from the fire. Now we're in a 500 degree environment. Our max time we're supposed to be in there is 5 minutes before things start failing. Now we got faster moving convection currents because we're closer to the fire or closer to the vent point. Now our gloves, our hood, our face piece, our hose, our radio, everything's failing. Nobody ever taught me that I should be aware of that 500 degree mark and the exposure and the duration of exposure. And in Michelle Donnelly's report, and 4 different reports I've read from NIST, they all say the same thing. The likelihood of a firefighter being in a class 4 environment for more than 1 minute over 500 degrees with fast moving convection currents is highly unlikely and strongly discouraged. And by the way, that's when the majority of those near misses and firefighter fatalities occur. Now, it's not just heat and temperature. Don't get me wrong. The other thing that's dismissed or not talked about in this is the mechanical damage. So let's think about this for a minute. The weakest link you wear, more than likely, is a 2 to 3 millimeter piece of polycarbonate around your face. Well, when it softens and we're crawling around in zero visibility and you bump into a sharp corner of something, that's that mechanical damage. Now, this fancy word heat flux is a fancy word for the amount of energy that's transferred to a small area or larger area to a surface, right? Why should you understand that? Because that's what's happening all around you. Energy is being transferred. It's happening in a normal environment. It's happening a lot faster in a fire. So let's look at this and see how much energy is being transferred to these Firefighters PPE in a flashover container. They're sitting underneath it, right? We're down low, we're below the heat. Or are we? Look at the heat above them in this Bullard camera here. Yellow's 500 to 800 degrees. Orange is 800, red is 1,000. The fast moving gray stuff is convection currents. So TPP is the measurement of that protective garment's thermal insulating performance, right? It also stops convection and radiant heat exposure to a certain extent for a certain amount of seconds. Okay, that score is based on the number of seconds before you receive a 2nd degree burn. For example, our department has around a 41 TPP. So if at 41 TPP, that means I supposedly have 20 seconds of thermal protective performance protection until I receive a 2nd degree burn. However, if I'm sitting in this environment for a long time and absorbing energy, do I have 20 seconds? What about the rest of your gear? What about your face piece? What about your gloves? What about your air pack when you realize your cylinder doesn't last as long as you think it does? If you want to read more about that, the latest performance requirements can be found in Nfpa 2112. You know, another interesting thing I learned when reading all this stuff is that the commercial industry, like if you work as an electrician and you have what's known as arc flash performance garments to protect you, that they believe that the thermal protective performance rating should be based on that person's ability to get a burn at 25% of their body to protect them at that point. Nfpa and the rest of the industry for the fire service says that we should wait till we get 50% of our body burned. I think I'd rather work in the commercial industry because they got a better rating. So let's look at this here. Your gear, that TPP number, comes from a controlled test in a controlled environment with a max temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Raise your hand in the chat room if you've been in over 600 degrees, including me, for more than 1 minute, like we were talking about a little bit ago. So we've already went past it, but it's how long, what's the duration of it? It's like touching something really hot for a second and pulling away. You can survive it. But if you stay in there too long, or you repeat that exposure, like we talked about with the gear, what happens every time I push it just a little further and a little further, and then one time I really need that TPP to go make that grab or push in there and get my friend, and my gear is already degraded and my mask has micro cracks in it, and then it fails. Did it fail me or did I fail it? I failed it because I didn't understand that I can't keep doing that without inspecting and taking care of it. So what is TPP? It's the measure of that protective garment's ability to insulate and protect you from those things I just mentioned. So what about my friend here who has on 2 hoods and standing up? What happened to his thermal protective performance right now if it flashed in that room? What about his mask? How many times is he going to be able to burn with that mask before those micro cracks become big cracks and become bubbles and become holes? How long is that going to take? You think he's inspecting it between every burn? Nope. You think 2 hoods is the answer? Or maybe getting down and keeping our gear cool? All this data, ladies and gentlemen, comes from a very smart woman who's passed away. Her name is Alice Stoll, and she worked for the U.S. Naval Institute. And the reason you have thermal protective performance, the reason why we know of words like second-degree burn, is because of her work. She wanted to figure out a better way to protect fighter pilots when they crashed. They were burning alive, so she wanted to create garments that would better protect them. But she needed actual empirical human data. Basically, she needed to burn people to get that. Well, nobody would volunteer for that until she voluntold 269 sailors and all burned their forearms. Science, right? That's great, good stuff. Back then, they could do that. And they all got a free weekend pass out of the deal. And they recorded that temperature and the time at which they responded to pain. And she got every little bit of data from it. It was consistent. And basically, here's some interesting things she learned. If that radiant heat that we fail to recognize in a zero visibility environment that we can't feel, if it hits that human victim and stays there for more than 30 seconds, that burn is permanent. So if I take that heat and hit that skin at 131 degrees and I stay there for 30 seconds, then I remove that heat, 2/3 of the damage occurs after the heat source is removed. Just like if you sear a steak and then you lay it on a plate for 5 minutes and let it rest, it's still cooking. That's what's happening to the victim and to you. She's the one that came up with the data that says, hey, if I produce this type of garment, it'll give them this many seconds of protection before they receive a second-degree burn. She quantified that term. And this is where her work comes into play. Basically, 131 degrees is a second-degree burn. 140 degrees, our pain receptors are turned off. And 162 degrees, our skin is destroyed. It's actually protein coagulation. It means the subcutaneous layer is cooking. Not a good thing. So what can our gear really take? By the way, this picture here is from a firefighter who was standing outside of a fire 30 feet away, just standing there, not paying attention. So Nomex can take up to 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Your skin can burn at 131 degrees, but your polycarbonate face piece that's 2 to 3 millimeters thick softens or begins to soften at around 290 to 302, depending on which mask you have, because there's 3 different ones out there currently. Actually 4 if you go back a little further. So, Brother Jimmy, you'll appreciate this because this is you. The inherent problem we have is 6 layers of protection around our butt and 1 around our brain. And then we stand up. This is from my friend Lars from Sweden who said that. And we're famous for that. We like to stand up. If you see the fact that we're absorbed with energy, that's not a good thing. So Jimmy's hot here, really hot. And that energy is being transferred to his gear. Now, he can come out of here and take it off and be fine. Now, but if he stays in here, that's not a good day. And by the way, that was one of the hottest rooms I've been in. thanks, Jimmy, for that experience, and also me getting lost that day and you saving me. So now another example of something that is really interesting to me is, how does your gear work when you sweat? Well, you hear firefighters all the time say, you don't want to go in there with wet gear. Well, there's a difference in wet gear from the outside and wet gear from the inside. Here's why. A recent study showed that we sweat just as much as Navy SEALs. That's the two people that sweat the most, 3 liters per hour. But if you sweat that much, like me, I was born with twice the human sweat glands, I believe. And as Joey said, this was a 3 liter per day here in Buchanan, West Virginia. It was 90 something degrees, and it was one of those rare opportunities we got to burn a college dormitory. That takes the TPP of your gear, or reduces it by as much as 10 seconds. Why? Because that thermal barrier up against your skin is now saturated with salt water. What's the greatest thermal conductor on the face of this earth next to anhydrous ammonia and hydrogen? Salt water. So when the first 2 layers of your gear are saturated with energy, and then they hit that soaking wet salt water layer, the energy is transferred to you like that. That comes from a research paper called Effects of Moisture on Thermal Protective Performance of Firefighter Protective Clothing, and that is included in the works cited phase at the end of this presentation. So sweat makes a difference. So how does this all work together? Let's look at everything. Your helmet shall not melt at or below 500 degrees Fahrenheit. There's that number again. Your hood should have a TPP of no less than 20. That's interesting, because Nfpa says the rest of your gear has to have at least 35. So my hood can have less than TPP than the rest of me? Basically, that equates to 10 seconds for a 2nd degree burn. Your face piece softens at 290, average failure 356, ultimate failure between, depending on which one, anywhere is 413 to as much as over 500 degrees. But there's different versions of face pieces in use today. Your glove, your average TP cannot be less than 35, but the interface layer, the part that goes up against your skin and your wristlet, cannot be less than 20, but it shall not melt at or below 500 degrees. Your coat and your pants all have to have a minimum of 35 for TPP, but get this, it can have reinforced areas that are 60 or above, but NFPA doesn't rate anything higher than 60. So when you look at your pants, same thing, could be 35 or it could be as high as 60. But if you think about it, where your coat and pants overlay or overlap, that's 6 layers of protection. So right around your waist is probably the best protection you've got. Your boots cannot melt at 500 degrees or lower. There's that number again. Here's an interesting one direct from Luxfer, the people who make almost all the cylinders in existence today. The cylinder core shall not reach over 160 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature. That shock you? Did me. Now, when does it get to that temperature with all that composite wrapped around it? I don't know. We don't have thermocouple wire shoved under there to know. Your tick, the germanium window, Captain Brown, I put this in there for you and my thermal imaging brothers and sisters, shall not be exposed to above 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we stand up with the tick and shove it into a convective current and wonder why it quit working, there's your answer. Your radio shall not be exposed to above 300 degrees, even though there's not an existing thermal requirement rating for those. So not above 300, 400, 500. But I thought my gear protected me in flashover to a certain extent. And where is most of the heat found in a fire? Brother Joe, if you're still on, this is your head. This is our awesome drill we did in Firehouse Expo. It's up top. And what are we exposing there? Our brain and our ability to think, and that 2 to 3 millimeter piece of polycarbonate that separates us from rescuer to victim. And we're standing up all day long because it's cool, right? No, because crawling sucks and I don't want to crawl. Here's an interesting little piece of information for you. Those of you who are like me, who like my leather helmet, there's another company that makes one called the Phoenix TL2 helmet. It's lighter and it's a really nice helmet. This particular video shows a friend of ours who was helping us recently in Virginia. We did 3 scenarios at the top of the stairs. Remember, it's top of the stairs. I want you to look at the convection currents coming out over the top of his head. Does it look like his helmet is in that path? And I believe Jake and Thomas can vouch for this in this particular incident. His TL2 helmet was warped and pulled off of the actual inner housing in those 2 to 3 scenarios. But yet the standard says the helmet shall not show visible flame or afterglow after 5 seconds of removal from flame. Your helmet should have a TPP of 20. So whether it's fiberglass or leather, if it's leather, it shall not shrink more than 10%, shall not melt, separate, or ignite after from the test. And looky there, shall not melt at or below 500. That number just keeps showing up. How about your hood? This is from an interesting study that showed 7 seconds of flame contact on a 2-ply Meta Aramid hood. When you asked the difference between regular hoods and the particulate blocking hoods, this is a standard hood. 7 seconds, and they did 9 different tests over 3 days. How much damage do you think it did to the person with just the hood on, the person with the hood and a mask, or the person who had the hood, the mask, and the helmet on? Because there are people that walk around with just a hood on, and people who have their hood and mask on don't have the regulator in. Well, let's look at the actual burn damage that was done to the person. If you just had a hood on, 67% of your face was burned in 7 seconds. If you had a hood and mask on, only 13.6% of your face was burned. That does not include respiratory. If you had everything on with a hood, mask, and helmet, this is a standard hood, not a fancy, brand new, whatever you choose hood, only 3.5% of your face was burned. Now, I'm not a smart man, but this guy who did this he's a PhD from NC State. And I think I'm going to trust his judgment on that. I'm going to wear my stuff. And if a hood protects me a little bit better, such as a particulate filtrating hood like the one I wear, and actually reduces that down to about 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds and keeps that stuff off of me, I think I'm going to wear it. So let's talk about your gloves. Nfpa 1971, remember what we started with? Your whole glove composite, the average TPP shall not be less than 35. And the glove interface shall not be less than 20. But wait a minute, what if I don't take care of my gloves really good? And you say, well, what do you mean by that? What if they're wet? And what if every time I get them wet, I wring them out? You know, every time you wring your gloves out, you can separate that inner liner, and then the next time you put your hand in, that liner may not be where it should be. If it's exposed to heat, it shall not shrink more than 8%. If Joey's on here, he can vouch for a particular incident we had with one of our instructors. He went and fluffed some straw up into the fire room, and the room ignited, and his gloves shrank to half the size. Half the size. They had to pull them off his hands. Your gloves shall not melt, separate, or ignite. And they must be donnable and flexible after these tests. How many of you had an experience where after you had that fire, the gloves were not flexible and donnable? And you shall not have a 2nd degree burn less than 10 seconds, which means 20 TPP. Remember, whatever the number is, cut it in half. Pain time less than 6 seconds, which means if I'm in somewhere and I feel pain in less than 6 seconds, my gloves are shot, or I'm in a really bad place. And it shall not melt at or below, look at there, 500 degrees. Now, Thomas is grabbing the door of the Max Firebox. It has a metal handle on it. Now, if you grab a pan or a pot or something that's in the stove with an oven mitt, eventually the heat will transfer through the oven mitt. What happens when you grab a soaking wet oven mitt that has a hole in it and you grab that same hot pan or pot? That energy is transferred a lot faster. So think about that with your gloves. Keep you an extra set of gloves. If you got wet gloves, you want to change into dry gloves. You don't want that, because those gloves, as good as they are not as good as the rest of your gear. Let's talk about your Scba. The fancy term there is Nfpa 1981. I won't bore you with the 3 paragraphs here, but what you need to understand about it is that they had a heat and flame resistance test. They mounted your face piece on a head form, and they blasted it with a what? Convection oven for 15 minutes at 95 degrees Celsius. So that's around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, with a simulated breathing thing on it so that it acts like it's breathing. And then after they did that, they did a direct flame contact for 10 seconds, and they dropped it onto something to basically simulate you and I running into something. Here's a guy crawling out of a burning window to be rescued, and he runs into the sharp corner of a wardrobe or something. So it shall not fail during that. And here's an interesting part that I didn't know. Your lens cannot incur damage that obscures your ability to see worse than 2100. Well, whatever that number is, because I got 2070 in one of my eyes. I have to wear, obviously, corrective lenses. So basically, your Scba face piece cannot fail and cannot obscure your vision in that 200 degree environment. Well, what about the new test? That heat and flame resistance test for NFPA 1981 in the 2013 version includes two additional tests where they elevate the temperature in that, and they add some more flame and they add some more radiant heat, and they do the same thing. They drop it and run into something. Now this time we're going 260 degrees Celsius, which is around 500 degrees for 5 minutes prior to direct flame contact for 10 seconds and then dropping it on something. So it's still required to keep the visual acuity and maintain positive pressure. Why is that? And that says for 24 minutes. Any loss of positive pressure during that test results in a failure. It's pretty darn good, but is it? We're going to show you different versions of that. Now, I want to show you something that I learned from a very smart group of people called the Illinois Fire Service Institute. You can look them up. They've worked with NIST and published a lot of cool things, and one of them is their most recent face piece study, which has a lot more accurate information than some of the older face piece studies. They compare all 3 different types of face pieces, and they also show you how to do an inspection of your face piece with a cell phone, which is pretty brilliant. And what you do is you take your Scba, take your mask, and you lay it on a table like this. And then you shine your light on it. And look what you see in the shadow. You see thermal damage, which you wouldn't normally see. You see that bend, that wave. You see micro cracking, which you wouldn't see. Because a micro crack, when it's exposed to more heat, becomes a bubble and then becomes a hole, right? And remember, your glass transition temperature, fancy word for when that polycarbonate starts to melt or soften, is around 300 degrees. So if it's softening at 300, and then I run into what they call mechanical damage, which means I hit something, something hit me, and then here's the most famous part that we all do. We attempt to clear that off of our face piece by doing what? Wiping our mask with a gloved hand and developing a hole in a system that works off positive pressure with a hole in it. How long is it going to maintain that pressure? Not very long. And then the superheated gases are going to come in and it's game over for us. 2 to 3 millimeters thick. Obviously, it is the weakest link. And it's stated over and over again, every one of the studies I read, it is a critical potential failure point. We have to understand that that gives us an advantage because we can wear it and we can see, but you've got to protect that face piece. And how do you protect that face piece? You keep the environment cool, you stay below the thermal layer, and you don't stand up and do dumb things in it when you may need that protection, that little extra few seconds of performance, because your average temperature at which that lens failed was 356 degrees. You don't want that to be the end result. It's plain and simple, because then we are a victim at that point. This comes from Mark Falkenham's line of duty death, which is why the standard changed. And it says in the test that it basically at 500 degrees after fast moving convection currents, this mask failed in 148 seconds. That's not just temperature. He was at the top of a flow path, the top of a chimney, fast moving convection currents. You can watch the ATF video, you can see the mannequin, and you can watch the heat hitting his mask, and you can watch it start to wave. You can see the bubble form, and you can see the whole form after that. And you can listen to the chilling mayday and understand why this will get us in trouble if we're not careful. This is our weakest link. And here's where you need to care, because not every department has the same mask and the same standard. This mask comes from a department in Louisiana. This is what they're wearing as of 2 years ago. So that's prior to NFPA 1981. Looks like a scuba mask. If you were been on the department long as I have been, when I was growing up, I had a Scott mask with a corrugated hose that looked like the elephant trunk, and it looked like this with the steel bottle. Then you have 2 different versions of NFPA 1981 2007 standard, and then you have the 2013 standard, all of which fail at different points. Well, which one are you wearing? You could have a department that has all 3 of those, such as this one had an AV 2000, which is your 2007 standard. This particular department had this occur after I taught a class in Woodlands, Texas. These 2 rookies did not come to the class. They stood on the front porch of a double-wide mobile home with a decay stage fire, forced the door with a hose line that wasn't charged. As they're standing with the door forced, it did exactly like the NIST face piece study said. It went from a decay stage fire. The front door literally breathed life into the smoldering fire, and the rush of the heat from now blazing living room transformed the relatively cool environment on the front porch into an inferno. These gentlemen were standing in a black convective smoke convection current that was just blasting their face piece. And one of them realized something was wrong and wiped his face piece and noticed parts of his hood fell off. He was just standing in a convection oven. So at 280 degrees Celsius, 536 degrees Fahrenheit is when that failure point is. He was smart enough to move away. Here's what Illinois Fire Service Institute did a great study. You can watch it. It's like a 3.5-minute video. You can pull it up on Facebook or Google it. Here's why you should watch it. 3 different face pieces, 3 different standards. Same test, same convection current, same temperatures, and they show when each one of them fails. Obviously, the one on the right is the newer mask, but I want you to look at the differences when they fail. The first actual failure starts showing up in 1 minute and 4 seconds. 1 minute and 4 seconds. Look at 1 minute and 34 seconds. The weakest, older mask, a bubble has formed. The one in the middle, you've got micro cracking and some failure, softening, and then you got micro cracking on the newer mask. When you look at the total failure of all 3, anywhere from 2 minutes and 18 seconds to 10 minutes and 4 seconds. But let me ask you a question. If the standard says it fails when I can't see, right here I can still see, but this happens around the 5-minute mark and 4-minute mark. Are you going to be able to find your way out? You can't see, you can't feel, and then I bump into something with that? It's not good. So this is a free video. You can pull it up. I'll send you the link when we share the Dropbox folder with you with the recording. This is our mask, depending on which one you wear. Which standard have you got? Have you got the 2007 mask, one of the 2 variations, or do you have the 2013? Does your apartment have an older one? Now, all that to being said, what's happening on the inside of the mask when you're in that environment? I've heard from different people about air in my bottle getting hot, what temperature that may be. I found anecdotal data, not evidence-based data, until recently when I read the NIST technical note on exploratory study of airflow from an Scba to elevated temperatures. What that means is they took an air pack and put a mask on a mannequin, and they put thermocouples inside the mannequin's mouth. And they made it breathe, basically. And they basically measured the temperature inside the mannequin's mouth. Why should you care? Because at what temperature can you not breathe anymore, no matter what's happening to your mask? Before the mask fails, at 300 seconds, at 212 degrees Fahrenheit exposure, the inside of your mouth can be 105 degrees. You can survive that. After 600 seconds, it can be upwards of 123. You're starting to get damage then. At 900 seconds, it's 134 degrees. That's not good, and that's in 212 degrees. Let's step it up a notch. Now we're at 302 degrees Fahrenheit for 300 seconds. Mind you, this is convection currents blasting that mask and that bottle. Your inside of your mouth can be 123 degrees Fahrenheit. At 600 seconds, the inside of your mouth is 149 degrees. You're in trouble. At 900 seconds, the inside of your mouth, you're starting to have some major damage, and you may not live. 163 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how long you're exposed to it, how deep you breathe. In the overall summary, in less than 7 minutes, the air inside your mouth can increase 16 degrees Celsius, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a big swing. And after 20 minutes at 212, the air inside of our mouth can reach 131 degrees. 212 degrees is not that hot. It's what you boil water at. There's some saunas that get pretty close to that, or steam rooms. After 210 seconds at 302, the Scba, the air inside of it, reached 104. After 20 minutes at nearly 400 degrees, the inside of your mouth, the air inside your mouth, is a fatal temperature of 205 degrees. They've proven that breathing humid air at 212 produces respiratory burns, and an actual burn report of burn victims showed that 185 degrees of superheated air for 20 seconds produced a fatal burn. This is why you should care, because I was always taught about the mask failing. Well, it doesn't matter if the mask fails if my lungs have already failed. Your lungs can fail before the mask fails. Nobody told me that, because we don't read all this stuff. So what about our coat and pants? Well, it doesn't do any good if I can't breathe, but here's some food for thought for you. This is why I'm so passionate about the thermal environment. This is what we can't see that's occurring to us, and we're well protected. The victim doesn't have that luxury. They're feeling pain at 109 to 109 to 113, and 131 degrees, they're burned just like we are. Their property starts to break down at 200 degrees, producing flammable vapors. And your gear, my gear, is breaking down between 165, your bottle, to upwards of 572 to 600 degrees max. So do you want to push it that far, or would you rather be intelligently aggressive and use the nozzle and cool the environment long before it gets there and make it better for the victim, their life, their property, and you? I'm not asking you not to go into fire. All of us signed up to go in there. But when you go in, make it better and protect those that you swore to do so, right? Because this is a friend of mine's gear as he walked out of a double wide trailer and 2 propane tanks ruptured. Should this concern you? He felt nothing other than, he said when he heard the pop, he said, "I'm dead." And his bottle was ruined. And those are the letters from the department burned into that moisture barrier. He said he felt nothing and he walked away without injury. He said he changed his shorts afterwards, but he walked away without injury. The gear did its job, but he felt nothing. Now, if 2 tanks flare and go over your shoulders and you don't feel anything, think about the environment you're crawling in and what that's going to do to you. If you look really closely in the upper left-hand corner, that moisture barrier is cracked. It wouldn't have taken much more before it got to him. So remember what I told you in the beginning. Nfpa 1971 has more than 70 tests for PPE. And my favorite one is the forced air oven test, convection oven. Remember that number, 500 degrees. There it is again, for 5 minutes, and fabrics cannot shrink more than 10%. Here's my question to you. How many tests do you have to prevent this? This is zero visibility. This is your convection oven. This is what you're crawling in, what I'm crawling in. This is the drill we did recently in Richmond, Virginia. This is 1 room away from the fire room, in between the stairs and the entry point. What's your test to prevent that? You're going to pencil the ceiling. You're going to wait till your ears get hot. You're going to stick your hand up in it. Too late. Your gear is becoming saturated. Your mask is softening. Your radio is beginning to experience damage. Your tick is facing things that will cause it to fail, and you don't know it. Because whether you use that tick or this tick, it's still the same fast-moving convection currents that is moving from hot to cold, transferring energy to everything it touches, including us. And we can't judge that based on our ears and our eyes anymore. We have to use extra things such as a diagnostic tool to simply see the problem and then fix the problem. I'm not asking you to keep the tick in front of your face the whole time. I'm asking you to look, see, and fix it. And don't squirt, it don't work like in this example here. So you were taught these basic modes of heat transfer in probably your firefighter recruit school: conduction, convection, and radiation, but it occurs in reverse to you in a fire. Convection and radiation hits you, and then your gear is saturated, and then you bump into something, and then you experience conduction, direct contact. It's a lot hotter than we realize. And when your gear is saturated, we're the baked potato. It's too late at that point. So we got to come out and get out of the gear. If you study firefighter CPR, where they drag firefighters out and they've got the drills on how they pop the gear off of them, you'll notice there are some documented incidents where guys and gals have taken their gloves off and decided to grab a hold of their loved one, their firefighter, their friend, their brother, their sister, and put their hands on this gear. What do you think happened to their hand? Brother Brown, who's on the call, understands that when we did training a couple years ago, we told every firefighter when we came out the last part of the drill that we did in thermal imaging training, do not take your gloves off and grab your helmet. But yet a couple of them still did. And when they grabbed that helmet, you heard psst and ow. That was not good. Yeah. And yes, EJ, very good point. Medics should be careful too, because they don't know. We got to tell them, don't put your bare hands on that gear. Get the gear off of them, right? Remember I told you in the beginning, the thing that shocked me more than anything was the Scba cylinder, high temperature exposure. It says in the instruction manual, a carbon composite cylinder that reaches a temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit or more should be sent to an authorized cylinder requalification facility. How many times have we done that? Because we don't know. The particular relevant in this case with Scba used by firefighters because of why? because they believe we're never exposed long enough to excessive heat to affect the cylinder properties, because even if we did, we would feel sufficient discomfort from life-threatening heat before this would occur. Now, does that make sense based on having gear that has TPP as high as 60? By the time you feel heat, if you're wearing like a Houston spec gear that is as high as 60, that bottle is a lot hotter than 160. And are they sending their stuff off to get tested? Who is? Yeah. We are not addressing this at all. Look at my good friend and fellow instructor, Jake Latson here. Look at his bottle. You think it experienced hotter than 160 degrees Fahrenheit by simply showing these firefighters what a down firefighter looks like when he lays on the floor, that you can see the bottle, you can see him, how his gear starts to blend in as it's superheated. His gear is absorbing heat, so it causes him to blend in, but his bottle was darker because it's cold from the compressed air, but his bottle is heating up. So let me challenge you with this. How well are we protected are we again? He's just going over to close a window. Look at his shoulders. In just a few seconds, look at his face piece, his mask, his helmet. He's going to get down, because look at this. This is straw and pallets. This is not couches. This is not sectionals and wardrobes and massive amounts of heat release rate that we normally face. See the backside of his hood behind his helmet there? That was the guy who went open the window. Look at the thermal layer we were taught not to disturb, that Brother Jimmy and I and everybody else understands that if that gets below 50%, that's a broiler that's heating everybody up in the room. It's not good. That's cooking everything in its path, including the victim, the contents, and us, with the high dollar gear that we bought to protect us. So, question and answer time. There's only 18 of us online. You can unmute your mics. I want to ask you some questions. When was the last time your gear and Scba was inspected? All 3 layers and face piece. When was the last time your PPE was washed? Dirty, wet, UV damaged gear, you know what it does now. And have any of you read the instructions on your turnout gear, and will you now? And if you don't have a program that includes gear inspection, cleaning, and cancer prevention, it's up to you to implement that. So how many of you have inspected your gear recently? Let's see, we got some people popping up here. But 2 weeks ago, awesome. Inspect and wash. Good job. Who else? Anybody find any problems when they inspected their gear? Some aha moments, like, ooh, I didn't know that was there, like what we call bruising. You open it up and you look inside and you see the moisture barrier has big dark spots, like on the bottom half back side of your legs where I was sitting on the floor. Last 90 days, part inspection repair cycle with 1851. Awesome. After every incident, it needs to be inspected. Yes, it does, but does it get inspected? Scba lens, aside from strap replacement, never. Gear is annual or quick visual after wash, gear washed after exposure. Good job. Good job, Chief. The thing is, the Scba lens is something you can do yourself now. You can actually, if you watch that video from the Illinois Fire Service Institute, they use 2 cell phones. They use a cell phone with the soft light to inspect it, and then they take another cell phone and they record the inspection, and then they date it. And they say, here we go. We recorded it after this fire on September 28th. This is when we had the incident. And then 1 month later, we had another incident, and we record, look at the difference in this mask. So you're showing the difference in the damage, and it's documented saying, this is why I need the mask replaced. By the way, if your logistics won't replace your mask, show that picture, do that video, then send it to them. You'll get your mask replaced. Just data that you can use. So speaking of masks, this is from Ottawa Fire Service. A good friend of mine challenged me with this. When you don't feel like wearing your mask, just determine which mask you want to wear. The one you wear for a few minutes in your fire, or the one you wear for the remaining parts of your life fighting cancer. Because cancer affects 1/3 of the population. How much of the fire service does it affect? Much more. Boston, it's like 2/3 of them can get cancer. So we already have a higher chance of getting it just living in America, and then you become a firefighter, you got an even more increased chance of getting it. And if you're like my family who has a genetic toxic cocktail, you've added those factors in there. That's not good. As they say, your Scba air is free breathe it, wear it, use it, take care of your gear, it'll take care of you. And everything I give you tonight, I'm going to put all this in a Dropbox folder for you to look at. This is the works cited. This is one of 5 different pages of information, but this is where it came from. The PowerPoints from the Fiero conference, I've got them in there for you. You can take it, use it, because here's the thing. I'm not here to make money. Yes, I charge y'all to be here because it takes a lot of work to do it, but here's my goal. I want you to take all this information, including this recording, and I want you to share it with the change agents of your department, your firefighters, and educate them on how their gear works and how you can take care of it and take care of each other. Because all this stuff I read online, all this stuff I got from these people, this information is free, but it doesn't do any good if we don't read it. From the cancer industries, like the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, to the International Firefighters, to Fire Decks, to MSA, to NC State, to Globe, to Nfpa, to NIOSH, to NIST, to some of my friends from KTF and others. Now, let me hit this button here. Stop share. What questions do you have? Oh,